I was about 24 when this happened. Before we begin, a few things should be mentioned. At the time, I was living with my parents. I always used to exercise to help with my anxiety and depression. I knew every trail at the local park, as I have lived down the street from it for many years. I usually took what they call the Loop Trail, which is about 3 miles long, and as the name suggests, it was one giant loop. On this particular day, I was so desperate for a nice, long walk that I ventured to the park in the pouring rain. Once I was done, I cut through a parking lot to get to another trail, since I wanted to walk longer than usual that day. As I entered the area, I noticed an old beat-up pickup truck. I didn't think much of it at that point, because it's a pretty popular park. But I remember thinking, who else would be out here in this storm? As I got closer, I noticed the driver was staring at me. In fact, he was fixated on me. I had to cross right in front of his truck to enter the trail. As our eyes met, a shudder crawled down my spine. It was like I could hear him in my own mind, saying, "I'm going to kill that girl." I immediately started having a massive anxiety attack. But remembering that I was prone to them, I tried to talk myself out of what I thought at the time was an irrational fear. All he did was make eye contact with me. The trail that I was on was parallel to a road, which led to another parking lot that my car was in. Someone relying on maps would only know of that one trail that led to the lot, but I knew of a secret shortcut. To my horror, I could see that the truck was slowly following me along the road as I walked down the adjacent trail. As I stepped into an area where I was out of his view, I heard the truck's wheels screech to a halt. I decided to trust my gut. The shortcut I mentioned leads over an old bridge that crosses the trail that I was originally on. I know this may sound confusing, but the bridge was shut down for maintenance some years back, and I guess the state never got around to repairing it. Despite the bridge's state, it was still possible to leap over the barricades and cross it. As I passed over, I noticed the driver of the truck hiding behind a tree just off the trail I was just on. If I had still been on that trail, I wouldn't have seen him until it was too late. He was holding a plastic bag and a rope. I guess it didn't occur to him that I would take the decommissioned bridge back to the parking lot. When he finally noticed me, he disappeared into the trees. I ran as fast as I could back to my car and took off. When I arrived home, I was hyperventilating, and I could barely get a word out. My mother gave me some medicine, and I tried to articulate what had just occurred. She calmed me down and convinced me that it was just my anxiety acting up again, and that I had created this entire scenario in my head. I woke up just in time to see a news report about a woman who had almost been kidnapped in another park in a different part of the city. The woman had been able to call 911 on her cell phone, and thankfully, the police arrived just in time. There was a standoff, and the perpetrator was shot and killed. I called the police, and they confirmed a description of the man and the truck he was driving. Apparently, this man was wanted for several cases of abduction and murder, always targeting women. I still walk at that park from time to time, but now I take my dog with me, and I have also obtained my concealed weapons permit. I don't like to talk about this much. The town that I grew up in was very small and safe, but the interstate ran right through it. When I was in high school, I was walking to my boyfriend's house one night. The street that I was on was sort of an entrance-exit way for the interstate. There was a couple of gas stations and a restaurant, but you could throw a stone and hit the interstate from them. I decided to take a shortcut at the junction and walk into a fairly classy but very dark neighborhood. It was a dead end, but I was going to cut across a field a bit further on. It was just past dusk on a summer Friday night. It never occurred to me how visible I was to the service plaza. As I was walking, I hear a car slowly coming up behind me. I turned to see a Volkswagen Beetle. I had no idea who Ted Bundy was. I don't think he had even made the news in my area yet. I kept my distance from the car though. He rolled down the window and said, "Hey there, do you need a ride?" "No thanks, I'm just enjoying a night walk. I live just up the road here. Who are you going to see?" I actually felt a pang of guilt. It was the way he said it, almost like a curious cop would. I told him the name of a friend who actually lived up there. "Oh, is that so? Well, I live 2 houses down. Why don't you hop in?" No thanks, I'd rather walk." The car was rolling closer, and I was taking steps backward. The driver then said something that is always a giveaway. "It's very dark out here. You shouldn't be walking alone. So come on, get in." His words carried a very strange mix of charm and malice. I declined again. What I heard him say next was terrifying. "You better come the hell back here." I knew that if I took off into the field, there was a fence where he wouldn't be able to follow me in his car. I hid, and I realized that I was shaking all over. I heard the car turn around, as though he was using the headlights to look for me. But no. I saw the Volkswagen hustle down the road, up the ramp, and headed north on the interstate. Years later, when I began reading about Ted Bundy and his almost hypnotic charm, and looking at his picture and even hearing his voice, I thanked my lucky stars that my instincts had kicked in that night. But in the moment I actually caught myself thinking, well, it is a long walk. I now know that if I had gotten into that car, I would have never been seen or heard from again. At the time that this occurred, I was not living the healthiest of lifestyles. I quit using drugs when I was 25 and I moved to France for 5 years. I had just recently moved back to the States this past summer. This is relevant because it speaks to my mindset at the time that this occurred and why I was so comfortable taking the absurd risks that I did. Simply put, I was a drug fiend back then. When I was 20, I moved from Baltimore to the Eastern Shore, thinking that the distance would help mitigate my habit. Unfortunately, this didn't work. Instead, I just ended up driving to Baltimore every couple of days and buying several $100s worth of narc, instead of just buying less on a daily basis. In the process, I got to know a couple of odd people. Some of them were hacks. Here in Baltimore, a hack is someone who operates as a cabbie, illegally of course. Often they take people into the city to pick up their orders, or just charge half the rate of a cab driver. Now, I wasn't in the habit of using hacks, but one night my ride went down a one-way street on the wrong way in front of a police officer, and we were pulled over and searched. It turns out the idiot had brought his stash with him, so we were promptly arrested. I was pissed. Around midnight that night, they released me. Not only had my friend admitted ownership of the stash, but the reason they used to search us, his license being suspended, was bullshit, and my friend's lawyer called them on it. So there I was, in the middle of Baltimore, with no ride, nowhere to go, in the middle of December. They released the men and women separately, and my friend had been released several hours earlier. I mentally ran through my list of options. I remembered the hack that I had met earlier that week, and decided to give him a try. I figured that at the very least, if he was still awake, I could pay him to come get me, and to drop me off at the Greyhound bus station to wait it out for the night. Well, I called. Not only was he up and about, he was only about a 10-minute drive from where I was released. The fact that he was still up at around 1 in the morning may have given a normal person pause. I just assumed he was probably a crackhead, tweaker, something like that, and just wrote it off as dumb luck, and I climbed into his gray sedan, just grateful to be out of the cold. Now, to give you an idea of the way this guy came off, everything about him was just gray. His vehicle was gray, his hair was longish and solid gray, even the shirt he was wearing, gray. In retrospect, the guy was as creepy as they come, but at the same time, he seemed unexceptional. And really, in the drug world, there are so many weird people that you are forced to deal with on a daily basis that unless someone comes off as blatantly volatile, you eventually learn just to ignore the crazy. If you don't, you'll drown in it. I asked the guy to take me to the Greyhound bus station, just wanting to get well and curl up until I could think about catching a bus. He just sort of looked at me, looking down, then back up, and then asked if I wanted to go watch TV at his place until the buses started running again. Looking back, I remember feeling a bit hesitant, but again, the guy seemed so unexceptional, such a non-entity, that I just couldn't imagine him being some kind of threat. And if I'm being entirely honest, I just wanted a clean, warm place to get it on. And I don't mean sex. I was well beyond withdrawal at this point. Taking my lack of response for hesitation, I remembered him saying not to worry, that he wasn't going to try anything. Maybe I should have mentioned before that I'm 5'6", 100 pounds, and 20 years old at the time. And that bus station wasn't the safest place for a small female like myself to be hanging out at 2 o'clock in the morning. Well, against my better judgment, I said, "Sure." And we proceeded to drive out towards the country. To this day, I'm still not sure which direction we left in. Wherever it was he lived, it was about a half an hour outside of the city. It wasn't in the woods, but in a heavily forested area. As we neared his house, he began acting a bit strange. Not enough to set off alarm bells. I'll never forget him saying that it was either the police chief of that county or the chief's son lived in that same cul-de-sac, and the guy had helped him out with a few predicaments. The house was right on a lake with a dock in the backyard. I have no idea what county this was in, and no one that I've described it to has ever been able to pinpoint it either. It was totally alien to me. We pulled into his driveway, and I was shocked to see that his house was closer to being a mansion than the hotel dump I assumed I was in for. He would go on to tell me as we parked and walked up to the door that it had belonged to his mother, who recently passed away. Here was this guy in his ratty car, in his ratty clothes, living in this extremely expensive house, driving around all day and night for pocket change, and basically living at Dunkin' Donuts. I was more than a bit skeptical. When we went inside, the situation became even stranger. The house was covered in two things: dust and knickknacks. And when I say covered, I do mean covered. Every square inch of surface was layered in tacky porcelain angels and dollar store crap. On the shelves, on the tables, even on top of an old television box. Even the kitchen was covered in them. The kitchen itself I only saw for a brief moment, but I'll never forget how even the sink was filled with things. I asked where the bathroom was and excused myself to go get high. I was getting pretty weirded out by this point, and just wanted to get straight so I could decide what to do. So I did my thing and went back to the living room, which was the first room you walked into as soon as you came through the door. I honestly didn't want to go any deeper into the house. I wanted to have a look at the lock on the door. create an exit strategy, and hope I didn't need one. That hope was quickly dashed. The first thing Mr. Gray did was bring me a glass of water and a handful of pills. Puzzled, I asked him what the pills were for. To sleep. It's 3 a.m. at this point, and I have to be at the bus station by 6. At most, we would have maybe 2 hours before I had to leave. I tell him I don't think that's a good idea. Since falling asleep wasn't on the agenda, I didn't even have time for a quick nap. Well, he begins to become pretty insistent that I take the pills. Believe me, if we weren't so out in the middle of nowhere, not to mention it being December and bitter cold, I would have bailed. Instead, I just sort of laughed and took 2 of the pills out of his hand, stuck them in my mouth, and took a sip of water, saying, "Well, what the hell?" Immediately he brightened and shuffled off to go get me another glass of water, which I had requested. Looking back, I shouldn't have even drank that water. I spat out the pills and shoved them in the sofa. This whole time we had been making small talk, talking about Baltimore, local politics, music, nothing deep. He then starts asking me about chemicals and drugs, specifically what sort of drugs would knock someone out, and how much you would need for someone, say, small, like myself. I try to act as if this is an entirely normal conversation. It seemed to me that my existence depended on not registering how abnormal this entire situation was. I think my thought process at the time was that I couldn't act as if I knew what was going on. I couldn't give away that I thought something strange or alarming was happening. I had to seem like a non-threat. The whole time we were having this discussion, he kept trying to get behind me. At one point he succeeded and started rubbing my shoulders. I just laughed and said that I wasn't a fan of massages and that I needed to run to the bathroom again. When I came back, I made sure to sit on a sofa that was up against the wall. I'm now looking around for a phone. However, I didn't want to ask for one because I didn't want him knowing my cell phone was dead. Another stroke of luck. My cell phone died 5 minutes after I called Mr. Gray to come get me. Now, the man had been pacing around the living room, sitting for a few minutes, only to get back up again, walk back and forth, then sat back down. He then began talking about his mother, how she collected these things, and how she died. It was a heart attack or a stroke, and how he was thinking about renovating the house, but didn't have the heart to make any changes just yet. He then says he wants to show me something, and wanted me to go with him upstairs. Why I didn't run out of that place screaming, I don't know. I think a part of me was still very much hoping that I was misreading the situation. Mr. Gray was just a lonely, creepy, and very socially awkward guy. He wasn't actually dangerous or anything. But here we have yet one more horror film trope coming into play. His creepy obsession with his mother. A bizarre dust-filled house, perfectly preserved in memory of his mother. Down to the last glass she used, still sitting on the kitchen table. I shit you not. And now the guy was trying to beckon me upstairs. He wanted to show me his mother's bedroom. So of course I follow him up the stairs. At first he makes it obvious he wants me to go up before him, but I wasn't having any of that. We get to the second story. He opens up the first door on the left, then goes inside. I'm half expecting to see the body of his dead mother lying in bed, but I was relieved when I found myself standing in just one more dust-covered room full of crap. I don't remember much about the room. The bed was made, and I couldn't tell if the comforter was dark or just covered in so much dust that it appeared that way. He gestured for me to sit down. I obliged. What followed was the worst of this experience. He sat down on the end of the bed next to me, and started talking about his mother again. After a bit, he looked at me and said, "You're so adorable. You remind me of a little girl." I tried to lead the conversation back to his mother. He gets up and walks over to the far wall of the bedroom and starts referring to our earlier conversation about drugs and knocking someone out, and what it would use to keep a child unconscious for a long period of time. At this time, I was still trying my best to act as if I was still on point, as if I'm not finding this line of conversation to be dreadful, creepy, and horrifying. I tell him I really don't know. I was just a dope fiend, not a chemist. He then says, "I want to show you something." I began to protest, telling him that I had to use the bathroom, but he insists and pushes the paneling on the wall, and a large square swings open. He gestures for me to come inside. He says that he's been working on it for a few years, and that it's just big enough for a small woman or a child. It was a sort of cot, and there were loops on the ends, for some type of restraint, I'm sure. I quickly got out of that room, back down the stairs. I didn't run, I just told him that I really had to use the restroom again. As I'm walking down the stairs, I pull out my cell phone and mimic dialing on it. I was lucky that he stayed behind to close the bedroom, so he couldn't see that my phone wasn't even turning on. I pretended to be having a conversation with a friend of mine, and at the point he showed up, I began loudly recounting what had transpired that evening. The first time I ever met Mr. Gray, I was with a friend of mine named Tom. I pretended to tell Tom on the phone how I called up that nice guy we had met at Dunkin' Donuts to come get me, and that I was at his house, but that we would be leaving here shortly. I then made Mr. Gray think that my friend Tom had offered to come pick me up from the bus stop. And in one respect, I was very lucky. Mr. Gray knew that I was living out of town, but he didn't know that I was almost 4 hours away. Or Tom would have had to make a hellishly long trip if he was going to come and meet me. I then said that I would head to the bus station as soon as possible, and that I would see him soon. I still remember the look on Mr. Gray's face as I said that. You know that snotty look kids get when someone actually dares to tell them no? It was like that, but worse. There was something almost perverse about seeing it openly displayed on the face of a 50-something-year-old man. So I grabbed my purse, zipped up my coat, all the while yammering on about how my friend Tom remembered him, and said to tell him hi. It seemed to me at the time there were two things that were very important. The first was to make it seem like I hadn't found him or anything he told me to be fucking disturbing. I didn't want him thinking that I was some sort of threat if he let me go. And secondly, I wanted him to know that someone could identify him if I went missing. Mr. Gray drove me back to the bus station and acted really shitty the entire way there. Looking back now, I am convinced that not only am I lucky to be alive, but that I spent several hours in the same house with a future serial killer. I did take down his license plate as he was leaving the bus station, and I contacted a friend of mine who was a police officer. A year or so after all this happened, there had been several disappearances of young children in that same area. My friend called me and asked if I still had Mr. Gray's information. I didn't, and I have a feeling that he didn't even bother to write it down when I told him. After hearing about the disappearances, I tried to track down Mr. Gray again, and returned to the same Dunkin' Donuts I first met him at. The owner said that men would spend every morning there for the past couple of years, but one day, he just stopped showing up. I think I finally figured out why he hung out there every morning. I noticed that there was a bus stop right in front of that Dunkin' Donuts. It was a bus stop for an elementary school.